Thank you for joining us for this session on Making OER Accessible to All, Principles for Accessible OER Design, presented by Charity Davenport. My name is Sarah Northam, and I will be the moderator for this session. I am joined by my co-moderator, Natalie Hill. I will be monitoring the chat for questions, and Natalie will be available to help if you have any technical questions. We ask that everyone in this session adhere to the OESS Code of Conduct. I have placed a link to the Code of Conduct in the chat, but want to emphasize a few things before we begin. The Open Education Southern Symposium strives to offer an open, inclusive, and friendly environment for all participants. All attendees are expected to help maintain a professional and welcoming environment free of any type of harassment. Together, we can create a space where individuals feel free to express themselves, work together, and come up with solutions to today's unique challenges. The organizers of OESS appreciate your help in making this symposium a friendly and welcoming virtual experience. Please note that all sessions are being recorded. Charity, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, so thank you for coming to my presentation about making OER accessible to all, principles for accessible OER design. And I only have about 25 minutes, so I'm going to be talking very broadly about accessibility, but I do have a handout that I've created and we'll be giving to everyone that gets into definitely a lot of details about accessibility and important individual principles for accessibility in OER design, and not just when designing or creating OER, but also for editing or adapting OER, so that, faculty, it's becoming really important that, when they're looking for course materials, that they're accessible. And a lot of times instructors may say, oh, I can't use this textbook because there's not an accessible version. With OER, if it's actually sticking to Creative Commons licenses and the 5 Rs, they should have the ability to revise and make those OER materials more accessible. So my name is Charity Davenport. I am currently an instructional technology specialist for accessibility at Pellissippi State Community College in Knoxville, Tennessee. Okay, there we go. And a little bit more information about me. I have a master's in teaching English as a second language. In my former life, I was an ESL instructor for 13 years at the University of Tennessee. And in that time, I created my own OER textbook. At that time, I was crazy and I made my textbook using LaTeX, which is actually more of something that's used for math instructors and not necessarily for English instructors. So, I'm trying to combine not only my love for technology, my love for OER, but also my new role as an accessibility specialist. I'm on this journey now to make my own OER more accessible. And so basically, I'm going to be giving you some tips and things I've been thinking about for making my OER textbook more accessible. I also went back to school and got another master's in instructional technology, and I also got a Creative Commons certificate because I love everything about OER. I feel like accessibility is important, not just for ADA or Section 508 compliance. I know that's a big deal. Faculty or instructors, teachers may get an accommodations letter from their student or from the disability services that says, hey, you have to make your documents accessible now, or you may get sued. But I think my approach, instead of scaring people into dealing with accessibility, I really want to emphasize how it's not just helpful for one student that may have an accommodation or may need, accessibility and accessible documents or technology. These kinds of principles are really helpful for any learner that's going to come across these OER materials. So I really want to emphasize that. So I want to think a little bit going on to, especially the UDL part, Universal Design for Learning, thinking about the kinds of learners. They may be students, they may be anyone on the internet that's accessing OER materials, but who are the learners? What is your average learner? And so we can kind of see in this picture, let's imagine this is a classroom and we can see, okay, I can see there's some male students, female students, maybe students of different ethnicities, maybe some of them are older, but there's a lot about learners and the diversity that they have that might not be something that we can see. We could say, for instance, one of these students is visually impaired. One of these students is a non-native English speaker. We have an older student. We may have a student in this classroom that has undiagnosed dyslexia or a learning disability that they are not aware of. One of these students could be a busy parent who doesn't have a lot of time. So basically, I want to say there is no average learner. We need to help build materials that will be accessible and beneficial to anyone who comes across these OER materials. So going back to accessibility and thinking about what kinds of disabilities that people have, and I think a lot of times, especially thinking about accommodations and the ADA and Section 508 guidelines and laws, it focuses a lot on having accommodations for users who are permanently disabled, for blind students, deaf students, or those with learning or cognitive disabilities. But in that group, we have students that may have a temporary disability. Maybe they've had eye surgery or they have an ear infection and it's really hard for them to, listen to a video assignment. Or maybe they broke their arm and they can't use a keyboard. And then there's also kind of situational disabilities that can affect anyone. I like the example of, when I'm on the bus and maybe I want to watch a video on my phone, but I can't have my volume up and be able to listen to it. I really want the captions so that I can still learn from this video without having to have the sound on. Yeah, it's like I have cognitive overload. I'm in a really stressful situation. I really need to study for a test, but the materials that I have are just, it's really dense and it's just really hard for my eyes to focus on this material. So there's all kinds of disabilities, there's all kinds of situations that people are in that can really benefit from both accessibility standards and universal design for learning standards. I'm going to check my time. Okay. So universal design for learning, UDL in short, was created by CAST using neuroscience research, and it's basically in three parts, for three parts of the brain that are involved in learning. The first one is the affective network, which is kind of like the motivation part, how learners get engaged and stay motivated, how they're challenged, excited by the materials. That's definitely part of the design of OER materials. There's recognition networks, which is the what of learning. I think that's the big focus on OER. It's like the content, the stuff that students are learning. How we gather facts, categorize what we hear, we see, we read. And so it's really important, and a big emphasis I have for this presentation is presenting information and content in different ways. This really helps with UDL, but it also is really helpful for accessibility as well. And then last is strategic networks. That's more on the assessment side. That's planning, performing tasks, organizing and expressing ideas. So that's more on the assessment part, which is usually sometimes outside the scope of OER creation. So for today, I'm going to be focusing a lot on the recognition part of UDL, which also includes some accessibility things. I'm also going to focus on 3 different disabilities for explaining these UDL and accessibility principles. Sensory, which means there's a disability with one of the 5 senses. Primarily, it's going to be sight or hearing. There may be physical disabilities, so that maybe students can't use a mouse and they need to use a keyboard or some other assistive technology to access information. And there are cognitive disabilities. So that includes learning disabilities, autism, neurodiversity, and maybe students with memory issues. So first for sensory, and I want to explain the picture here. This is one of our blind students that we've had on campus that I'm so proud of. She is going to be going to Harvard, and I'm really excited for her. And she had a lot of support from faculty making sure that her course materials were accessible. So I really wanted to emphasize like how much of an impact having accessible OER and accessible course and class materials can be for students with disabilities. But again, I want to emphasize they're helpful for everyone. So those with some sensory issues or disabilities, if they're vision impaired, it's really important that they have access to digital text that can be read by a screen reader. One great thing that I love about OER is a lot of times it's already in a digital format. A lot of students are going to have issues with only having access to a print version of course materials. It's good to have options. It's good to have both. It's not only great for screen readers, and screen readers are technology that helps read aloud everything on a screen to someone who cannot see. Text-to-speech is very similar. It'll read text out loud. This is usually useful for those with cognitive disabilities. There could be some assistive technologies available to turn digital text into Braille. Audio descriptions are really important. This is where, in addition to having captions, which is more helpful for those who are hearing impaired, videos will need audio descriptions if something is happening visually in the video that a blind user can't see what's happening visually in that part of the video. There's someone describing orally the context of what is happening in that scene in the video. If there are images, they need to have alternative text so that any user with a screen reader, they can't see the image, but maybe this image is really important to understand the text as well. Color contrast is very important, specifically for those with color blindness. I think also if you've seen some strange color combinations, they can hurt your eyes even if you don't have color blindness. And then a last important thing is having a document where it's possible to shrink or enlarge the font, especially enlarge the font so it's easier to read for those that are visually impaired. For hearing impairment, it's important to have accurate video captions. I want to emphasize here accurate because there's a lot of tools that do automated captioning, and many people may think, okay, that's good enough. It has captions. But really, for ADA compliance, it's really important that they be edited for correctness. A lot of times we have to correct automated captions because it does not understand what the word Pellissippi, our school name, is. So it's important to make sure those video captions are edited for correctness. And then also for non-videos, just for audio like podcasts, it's important to have an audio transcript. For physical disabilities, mostly this is making sure that whatever you're using can be accessed by keyboard only. So usually this is for if people can't use a mouse, and it might be they have a hand injury. I think a lot of us are being affected by like carpal tunnel or some wrist injuries from overuse. So this is like an alternative way to access information without using a mouse. It's also important for visually impaired users who are using a screen reader because they don't know where the mouse pointer is. So they're using a keyboard to find the information on the screen. This also requires some attention on making sure the formatting in documents and the reading order is correct so that the screen reader knows which thing to look at first, which is second. I'm thinking specifically about like tables. Like think about if someone can't see a table, how do they know what information correlates or has a relationship with what information? Usually that means having a table header so that we know, okay, here's the header, this is the topic, and then maybe also a header column so that it's easier to access using the keyboard only. Usually it's tab to see or know the relationship between the data in that table. Also, I think it's really important, try to make as few clicks as possible for someone to use OER. I think this is more towards if faculty are using OER, maybe bring that OER into the LMS instead of sending students out. And who knows how many clicks, they may get lost. Clicks are important. And lastly, for cognitive disabilities, a lot of this is kind of just making sure that the content is easier to understand and can reduce cognitive overload. So that might be checking the language, looking at like the grade, the readability. I think I saw one place said like a high school readability, but I would say middle school, I think would be better. If you have a lot of jargon, and I imagine a lot of academic texts have a lot of specific vocabulary, maybe have a vocabulary list or a glossary so that they can more easily access that information. They also benefit from a lot of the other assisted technologies for the visually and hearing impaired, like text-to-speech. One of my favorite things is Immersive Reader in Word, because it's not only text-to-speech, but you can change the colors, you can change the font. This is really important for those with dyslexia. It has a built-in translator, built-in picture dictionary, and it's easily accessible within any Word document. They'll also benefit from having the image alt text, and it usually some text-to-speech technologies will read those out loud. They also benefit from captions and transcripts. Think about the visual design of the OER and make sure it's not cluttered and having a lot of like pages and pages of just paragraphs and text. Try to break up that material into smaller chunks, smaller lessons, some units. Maybe break up those materials with images and also with short knowledge checks that can help someone kind of stop and think about what they just learned and kind of self-regulate their own learning. All right, I don't have a lot of time, but here's basically my my emphasis here outside of accessibility, but it involves accessibility, is why different kinds of OER and having access to different kinds of OER is so important. So having a digital option for OER is important because, like I mentioned before, those texts and images are going to be more accessible to a variety of assisted technologies. Digital OER that's online can be more interactive using annotation tools or H5P. It's more accessible because it's on the internet and anyone can get it. And having digital OER makes it much easier for others to use that 5R to be able to revise and edit the OER for their needs. Why OER is important to have in a variety of formats. That could be online, Word documents, Google Docs, PDFs, EPUB, some kind of offline standalone package as well. Because some formats are more accessible than others. PDFs are really hard to make accessible. I think the best way to make an accessible PDF is to make your document, make your OER in Word, and then export it to an accessible PDF. But again, PDFs are not very accessible. They're really difficult to edit. PDFs, Adobe PDF, Adobe Acrobat Pro has an accessibility checker, but that means you have to buy the expensive Pro version. But on the other hand, PDFs are a good downloadable offline copy, and they're printable. So there's pros and cons, and that's why having a variety is really helpful. EPUBs they're kind of weird because it's kind of only for like Kindles or reading devices, but because they're based on HTML, you can use HTML accessibility standards, the WCAG, to help make sure that the EPUBs are accessible. And lastly, emphasizing why print and downloadable OER is important. I'm thinking about, I'm working with a group for OER creation in Africa. So those students have a lot of limited access to the internet. They don't have a lot of bandwidth. And so having OER be downloadable is really important for them. So that also includes videos. YouTube is great. You can have a Creative Commons license with YouTube videos, but you can't download them. It's not possible. So making sure that not only those files are not too big, but also that it's just possible for them to download. And then, like for me, I like digital stuff. I like technology, but I also like paper copies. It's really important for me to be able to read and highlight and take notes by hand. But I also like having a digital copy, if I want to listen to it instead, my eyes are tired looking at the screen all day. It's like, no, I I need another option. All right. So in conclusion, take advantage of a variety of accessibility checkers. I feel like Microsoft Office products are probably the most accessible tools out there. If you're using an LMS, it probably has an accessibility checker. Publish in a variety of formats. Make sure there are offline options. Make sure at least one of those formats is accessible. I have my handout here with a whole lot of accessibility stuff more in detail. And my email is here if anyone has any questions about OER and accessibility.
Charity, thank you so much. That was great. Is there any way you could drop the handout in the chat box? Do you have that accessible online?
I have it accessible in a variety